then thank you very much, Mr. von Hippel, Frank von Hippel. You are an American professor of environmental health sciences in the Mel and Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health at the University of Arizona, and the lead of the university's One Health Research Initiative. And you study biology at the University of California, Berkeley. And before we maybe start talking about the field that you are researching, my first question would be, how did you actually come about being a researcher in biology and dive into that field of research that interested me the most?
Sure. And first, thanks for having me on your show. It's nice to meet you. So I'm actually from a many generation academic family. I think I'm the fifth or sixth generation of scientists in my family. I know you're in Germany, right? This is a German podcast, and
Yes.
my father was actually born in Göttingen and my mother in Vienna. They were Jewish refugees from the Nazis, but their parents were in academics. My father's my grandfather was a professor in Göttingen in physics, and my great-grandfather was a professor in physics in Germany, and actually a couple of generations before that as well. So academics is kind of the family trade. It's like if your family owns a general store and it gets passed on from generation to generation, just the love of academics is something that got passed down in my family.
Okay, I got that. Okay, so this is something but did that also like occur to you because of your family background that okay, like my relatives were really known and professionals in that field, so I also want to go there? Was it also, or what was there like also maybe a situation where you said, this really motivates me right now to also start with it?
Yeah, it's both of those, but it's also just growing up in a household where we're always talking about science, and just issues around the dinner table tended to be around science. And so I learned a lot about the way science works and a lot about science history just as a kid growing up, and I found it very interesting. And I grew up in Alaska, so I was born and raised in Alaska. I always loved the outdoors, and so I was motivated to go into a career that involved being in the outdoors and involved conservation and ecology. So that's really the training that I did. My undergraduate training was mostly in ecology, and my graduate training was in evolutionary ecology. And then I got into conservation biology and studying problems with pollution and contaminants around the world.
Okay, interesting. To be honest, the first time I heard about you was when you were on the Joe Rogan podcast, because you also gave an interview there. And that's how I actually also was really, or came about being interested in the field that you're studying. And what you are known for is ecotoxicology, as you could like describe it scientifically. Could you maybe like explain to the listeners at first, like what that actually means and what that is about?
Sure. So if someone is a toxicologist, they might be looking at the levels of some kind of a contaminant in a person's body and trying to solve whatever health problem they have. An ecotoxicologist is doing the same thing, but in the environment in general. And there's about 350,000 synthetic chemicals that are out in the environment. These are man-made chemicals that have been released into the environment. Many of them are toxic. We have very little understanding of how they interact with each other, what impacts they have on the environment. So an ecotoxicologist studies these synthetic chemicals as well as naturally occurring chemicals that are toxic, and their impacts on nature, their impacts on wildlife, and their impacts on human health. I do all of those things. So I do community engaged research. I tend to work with small communities, oftentimes indigenous communities, and I work on problems with pollution in their communities. What are the impacts of the pollutants on their health, on the wildlife in that area, on the environment in general?
Okay, that's interesting. And to kind of maybe dive deeper right there, because I read an article in the preparation for this podcast about the effects of climate change on generally the environment, but also on how this affects people strongly in their day-to-day lives. which is not only an issue in Europe, but in the US as well, because climate change is basically everywhere the same. So, how do you like, what do you think? How is this going to affect us, or is it affecting us right now and also in the future, in the next 5 to 10 years? How difficult is it going to be to live outside?
Yeah, well, climate change is affecting everybody, but it's not affecting everybody equally, actually. So the Arctic is warming at 4 times the rate of the rest of the planet. And so it's actually a much bigger problem in the Arctic than it is elsewhere. And this is something I've been working on in Alaska, where we're trying to understand how climate change is increasing the mobilization of so-called persistent organic pollutants from ice and from permafrost, and making those chemicals available again for incorporation into wildlife and into people. But that's just one of many issues with climate change. So the big issues that people generally talk about are, of course, the warming, but it's also the rising sea level. And rising sea level is caused both by melting ice caps and by thermal expansion of water, because as water warms up, it actually gets larger. And so that's even a bigger problem than melting ice caps. And then increasing storms around the world, storm surges. There are just many different issues. Disease is increasing because many diseases are vectored by temperature sensitive animals such as mosquitoes. And so you have diseases like malaria and dengue that are increasing in latitude. They're getting farther and farther north. They're getting higher and higher in altitude because of warming. So it's a really complex issue. And it's even more complex than that because climate change is just one of 9 so-called planetary boundary threats. These are threats to the sustenance of life on Earth, and it's one of 9. And these 9 threats, they interact with each other, and they are all very complex. Another one of the 9 is chemical pollution, the one that I work on. Another one that I'm sure you've heard about is stratospheric ozone depletion. But there are 9 of these, and they're all very serious threats to the planet, to humankind, to nature that we have to contend with.
Okay, and so the issue is also that basically it is possible that these diseases basically move also like further north because it is basically getting warmer and warmer in the colder parts, like because Alaska is like a very cold part so of the Earth, so it's or of the US, so it's kind of getting worse and worse in these areas.
Yeah, the disease problem is not one that's really reached the Arctic yet. It's more in places like Europe and the United States, where a lot of diseases that are tropical diseases are now showing up in these areas because of the warming. So if you imagine a mosquito like Anopheles mosquito that vectors malaria, it can't live in very cold environments, but as it warms up, its range expands, and you can get expansion of the range of malaria, which is the biggest disease killer of humankind, of any disease. And there are many other diseases like this. So we have all these challenges now that we have to find suitable solutions to, that have to do with climate change, that have to do with expansion of human activity into nature, that have to do with pollution, et cetera. And this is really why I'm focused on a One Health approach, because with the One Health approach, you're trying to understand problems in terms of human health and animal health, but also the health of the environment and how those things interact in order to solve the problems. So a more holistic viewpoint of what the problems are and what the solutions may be.
Okay, okay, that's interesting. So, but if you like look at the development of climate change now, because we experience it as something very drastic, and right now we have like wildfires in Greece, for example, very strong. Also in the US, there has been like very strong heat waves. So, is it like I had to like for you as a scientist and from your perspective, is it something that you would have expected to happen like that, or do you think it would have been something that would like progress not that fast?
So human-induced climate change was actually predicted in the late 1800s based on the burning of fossil fuels. It's not something new. It may be new to many people in the public, but it's not new to scientists. And In fact, when I was in college in the early 1980s, it was already very well established what was going to happen and approximately when it was going to happen. So none of this is a surprise. I realize that it's only reached the public attention in more recent years in terms of a really better appreciation for what the issues are. But scientists have been warning about this for many decades. And this is kind of a general pattern where we have a problem, it's identified by scientists, and it takes a long time for the political kind of slow churn of politics to do something about it. With climate change, we still haven't done anything meaningful about it. We still do not have any meaningful international agreements to do with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There are agreements, but they're not very meaningful agreements. So we have a long way to go with regard to doing something about climate change. And we have a long way to go about many of these issues. One of the issues that we have addressed effectively is stratospheric ozone depletion. So the Montreal Protocols were the first international agreement to solve a global environmental problem that were effective. And the ozone hole is repairing itself as a result of the Montreal Protocols. So banning chlorofluorocarbons. So we know that humanity is capable of coming together and solving problems like this, but with climate change, it hasn't happened yet.
Okay, so that is something that is still like has to be solved. So it's a big issue that we face. But do you think there's like one solution to the problem, or is it like multiple solutions that we have to work on? What is your take on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's for sure multiple solutions. There's not one thing to solve a problem as complex as climate change. Some of the solutions are already underway, like technological innovations to improve energy efficiency, to come up with new sources of energy. We've seen a huge reduction in the price of power derived from solar energy, from wind, and so on. So those are all positive developments. However, the consumption is still increasing. You know, we still have a highly consumptive society where we haven't reduced our consumption to a level that we need to. We still have to develop new energy technologies that can go up to scale and replace fossil fuels. That hasn't happened yet. So although wind and solar have been gaining in strength, they still comprise a tiny part of our energy sector, and we still have to address issues like tropical deforestation. So we are still cutting down the world's rainforests that have many important functions for the planet, including absorbing carbon, but also they're the main source of biodiversity on the planet. And that's one of the other 9 crises, is the loss of biodiversity. So there's a lot we need to do, and it's going to be probably 100 different things that we have to do to solve climate change.
And because this is something that you also wrote in your article, an article I read about you, that about 10 or 20 basic plants are used in the world and feed 80% of the world's population. So, or a very, very small number of plants. So how has this developed? Why is this such an issue also for biodiversity?
Right. So I think you're referring back to the industrial agriculture base, and that as humankind around World War II switched from kind of small family farms to industrial scale agriculture, there were great pushes for efficiency in order to increase food production. And so one of the things that's happened is a reliance on fewer and fewer crop varieties that have high yields, but that poses all kinds of vulnerabilities. And if you go to my world of studying pollutants like pesticides, it also means intensive use of chemical pesticides to grow those crops, which is not sustainable because those chemicals are also damaging ecological integrity. They're damaging human health, wildlife health. So your question is a complicated question. There's a lot of elements to it, but one of the many solutions that we need to implement is having a much more diverse agriculture, relying on what's called integrated pest management for our agriculture, where it's minimal use of chemical pesticides and all kinds of other strategies put into place that we know how to do it. It's just that it needs to be implemented as the normal source of agriculture.
Okay, so to increase biodiversity ultimately, and to also because is this a healthy way of living? When you think, I didn't know that, but when I read that, I felt like, okay, that's not a lot what I eat then basically all day, because it's very few, yeah, basic ingredients, and then you have, I mean, like, is this an issue from also like a nutrition perspective, when you like think about health in general, that we eat so few diverse, yeah, vegetables and crops in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can just give you a personal example. When I'm in the United States, I can't eat the wheat and the barley and the other grains here because the they cause me stomach upset. When I'm in Italy, I can eat it because in Italy, as you go to different regions, it's all these different varieties that everything is a locally sourced variety of grain that they're using, and so they're not relying on this industrial scale grain production for their bread. So I've even noticed it myself that um, there are parts of the world where they're still practicing kind of the older ways of having a greater variety of grains in use, and it doesn't. Many people find that they can eat that food without stomach upset. It's also many of those grains are higher in nutrition, are better for your health. So for sure, there's impacts on an individual person's health, and there's a big movement around the world of going towards more ancient grains and local varieties and that sort of thing. I interviewed a very interesting woman about this for my podcast about local sources of grain, local varieties of grains, and other plants as well. Or another example would be if you went back to the 1500s and the Incan farmers in Peru who were growing potatoes, they would have hundreds of varieties of potatoes on a single plot of land. And then you go to Ireland in the 1840s at the height of the Irish potato famine, and you had a population of millions of people relying on a single variety of potatoes. So when the pathogen came through and killed one potato, it killed all the potatoes. It wiped out the whole crop of Ireland. So we also set ourselves up to be vulnerable to these kinds of disease outbreaks that wipe out our food supply by having such a monoculture rather than having diverse food base.
Mm. Definitely. So that's definitely an issue. Could you, or is it possible to also draw maybe a parallel then to also, like, for example, like what happened in China with the outbreak of the coronavirus, which is something that people still are debating about, whether it happened at the Chinese wet market in Wuhan or at a laboratory somewhere in China. Although I read that the CIA and some other agencies of the United States believe it's from the laboratory and not from the wet market, but the issue still seems to be that we are very close to sometimes animals on markets where we also should not eat them, maybe, and maybe we should like not interfere with them that closely.
For sure. And COVID-19 is just the latest example of this. We've had several similar respiratory viruses that have emerged in Chinese wet markets over the years. And the previous outbreaks, some of them were actually more deadly than COVID, but they were thankfully stopped before they got out of China. But it's a very dangerous practice to be consuming wildlife in the way that they're doing in these Chinese markets. And um, whether whether COVID-19 emerged in the wet market or in the laboratory, in either case, it's a bat coronavirus, and it was humans interacting too closely with these bats, whether consuming them or consuming wildlife that were infected by them or bringing them into the lab, whatever it may be. It's just a terrible practice to be doing that, um, and it's a very very dangerous thing. And that scientists have been warning that these markets are a source of viruses for epidemics and pandemics for many decades. This is not a new thing. This has been known for a long time. China has promised to crack down on these wet markets before, and yet they continue to have them and they continue to be a source of disease.
Mm. And still, of course, it is like the source on the one hand. On the other hand, um, people were also like a little bit afraid that okay, certain regions are being blamed for these issues, certain nationalities are being blamed for these issues. Although I mean, disease outbreak can happen anywhere, because I read that something similar to the coronavirus actually happened in a lab in Germany, I think 20 or 25 years ago, which was also sort of a coronavirus, which like yeah, exited the lab, exited by accident. And so, isn't that also an issue that sometimes regions are being blamed for issues that, yeah, maybe cannot be related directly to the people living there?
Yeah, I'm not really interested in a blame game, but as someone who works in public health, I'm interested in preventing these kinds of diseases. And so it's logical to say that given that wildlife are the source of many of these viruses, it's dangerous to have wildlife markets where people are eating these wildlife and giving a chance for the virus to hop from an animal species into humans. So that is a dangerous practice. It's also a dangerous practice to bring in viruses such as this, or the animals that harbor these viruses, into the lab. So you could say, yeah, I would blame the people who are running these markets, or I would blame the government for allowing these markets, or I would blame the scientists who bring these things into the lab, whether it's in China or Germany or the United States or elsewhere. Sure, you're blaming individual people for making poor decisions. That doesn't mean that you're blaming the Chinese people or the German people. It doesn't mean you're blaming the average person, but there are people responsible who are making irresponsible decisions that put the whole world at risk. And there are other examples in history of research labs where the pathogen they were studying escaped from the lab. So we don't know yet if that was the case with COVID-19, but it has happened before. And thankfully, in the previous cases, it didn't lead to a pandemic, but it could have. So one has to be very careful about how these diseases are studied and how they're handled in the lab. And we know all too well that human error is rampant, right? Whenever people do something very complicated, there's a high risk of human error leading to some kind of an outbreak. So we also know that there are different levels of regulation and protections in different countries. One of the things that happened in the United States about 15 years ago during an audit is that the government found smallpox virus vials that were unprotected in various government labs, and they had just been sitting on a shelf and they weren't properly contained. So, and that's a disease that was the first disease eradicated from the world. So you could just see that if that kind of thing is happening in the most advanced scientific country in the world, then we've got a problem, right? And it's not a Chinese problem or a German problem. It's a human problem that we have to solve. We have to be very careful on how these diseases are handled. Another element of it is just too much incursion into the natural environment by people and leading to more and more frequent interactions between wildlife and humans that cause these jumps. And once a virus has jumped from a wildlife species to humans, it's transmitted all over the world instantly because of air travel and the various trade networks that we have. So what we're seeing is that there's more and more frequent emergence of diseases, and they're spreading more quickly because of these factors.
They are definitely, and as you mentioned, because we are the trade is also like an element of it, because the trade is increasing in the world. Like we have a lot of international trade between the U.S. and Europe, between the U.S. and China. This is increasing rather than decreasing. There has been also like some debate about whether or not it makes sense to, or after the coronavirus and also after for example, like the Russian attack on Ukraine, that we should deglobalize a little bit, like we should like pull back from it a little bit. Would you say that's a smart idea, or that's not a smart idea in terms of all these issues that we are dealing with at the moment?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, on the one hand, if we deglobalized a little bit, it probably would not impact the spread of disease because there's still people traveling for vacation. There's still, people move about and move about very quickly. And so those diseases are likely to spread pretty much as fast at this point, given all of our modern transportation that occurs commercially and personally, it's probably going to spread just as fast. But there are a lot of other reasons to consider deglobalization, including environmental reasons, including to do with climate change. If you're extracting oil in a place like Alaska and you're shipping it to some other part of the world to refine it and somewhere else then to produce it into a plastic, and then you're shipping that plastic somewhere else in the world to make it into some product, and then you're shipping that product somewhere else in the world, that's a whole lot of energy used to get that rubber ducky to the kid in the bathtub that started out as petroleum being pulled out of the ground in Alaska. So it just seems absurd that we have that level of shipping around ingredients and so on that leads to environmental problems. Another issue is that the wealthy countries of the world, like Germany, like the United States, we tend to ship our dirty processes overseas. So if there's something that's polluting, it's going to be done more in a developing country and less in our own country. And that's because the regulations are lower, the cost of labor is lower. And so there's an injustice there that the people are being exposed to more pollution, that they're suffering the consequences of that industrialization, and then we're reaping the benefits of whatever the product is. So we could go on, but there are many problems associated with globalization that have to do with environmental degradation and injustice in terms of exposure to pollutants and that sort of thing, in addition to the impacts on climate change.
Mm-hmm. And this is also a good point where I could ask the next question about, because climate change is the overarching issue at the moment, and it is something that is we have to deal with right now. Also, I don't have kids, so I don't know, but like when I maybe like in 10 years or so, maybe I will have, or if I try to have a family, for example, like what would that like look like in the next 20 years? Because many young people, climate activists today are saying, okay, I don't want to have kids, or I'm not sure if I want to have kids because of the development of the climate crisis. Do you think that's a too radical point of view, or is that actually more or less realistic?
I think that's a mistake. And I think that the kind of people who are really concerned about the environment, whether it be climate change or pollution or any of these other issues, are the kind of people who are going to raise the children who are going to help solve these problems. And so I think it's an overly pessimistic view to say we shouldn't have kids anymore. I think kids are wonderful. I think families are wonderful. And I remember this has been a big issue for a long time. Even back in the 60s and 70s, people talked about ZPG, zero population growth, and how we need to make sure we don't have more than one kid per person or two kids per couple, so that we don't have population growth. And there's something to that. But on the other hand, we need creative, smart, hardworking people to solve these major problems and to do something about it. And so that means we need people who are concerned and who want to improve the world. We need them to have children. We need them to raise the next generation of kids who are going to help to deal with these problems.
So that's I agree with your point of view, actually, and I agree with what you said, that would be too pessimistic and too critical, and that's overly fearly of the future, because the issues at hand are issues where we have to solve together with new solutions and new people. So aren't maybe sometimes these debates a little bit sparked too much by fear and anxiety, rather than optimism of how we can actually solve these problems?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's not like previous generations didn't have their own very serious problems. I mean, even just go back to my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, or your great grandparents' generation. The whole world was destroyed. World War II, the whole world was basically destroyed. Europe was devastated. Asia was devastated. And that generation had to contend with rebuilding society, rebuilding out of the ashes of fascism, um, and we had major upheavals around the world that gave that in Russia it was Stalinism, where millions of people were starved to death and put in the gulag. And in your country, in Germany, it was Nazism, where the Jews of Europe were destroyed, and virtually all of Europe was destroyed. And we can in Japan, it was Japanese imperialism that caused devastation throughout the Pacific. So I would say that generation, the generation that my parents were born into, and my grandparents were adults at that time, they've dealt with challenges that are in many ways more serious than anything we're dealing with. And not only that, we know what we have to do to solve many of these problems like climate change. And some of those solutions are being implemented. Other ones we still have to do, but we know what has to get done. So I am more optimistic about it. I think that we will solve these problems. It's not that the world can be returned to what it was, because some of the problems, environmental problems, are irreversible, like the sea level rise. Once the ice is melted and you have that thermal expansion of water, you can't return that water to the ice. So there are some things that they'll play out for centuries. No matter what we do now, we'll continue to have melting. But many of the problems that we're discussing can be solved. And like I mentioned before, the Montreal Protocols are a great example of this, where the whole world was threatened by stratospheric ozone depletion, and the nations of the world came together to find a solution that's been effective. So unfortunately, conflict often gets in the way of solving these problems. And right now, you're sitting very close to the biggest ground war since World War II, as the Russians invaded Ukraine, and they're causing a spike in food prices around the world, preventing Ukrainian grain exports. We have these kinds of just completely unprovoked, unnecessary wars that are devastating people in Ukraine and in itself causing tremendous environmental damage. So we also have to be finding ways to reduce human conflict so that we can really attend to problems that affect everyone around the world. And everything is tied together. So you have something like the invasion of Ukraine. It's driving up food prices in the developing world. That leads to instability in the developing world, which leads to more migrants, which leads to more political crises in countries where the migrants are arriving, like in Europe. So all of these things are tied together in complex ways. And I guess it's hard, but we need to find a better way to manage conflict.
I agree with you. I think which is sometimes for me personally makes me sad, something that in Europe this appears to occur still in Europe for some reason, that we have wars. This is something that I see as a problem, although it's Eastern Europe now, but as a continent that says Europe is like, people have an understanding of we have so much history and culture and stuff, but the wars still keep happening in the 21st century, which is unimaginable if I mean, if, as you said, like all the history happened, like how is this possible? Like this would never occur between Canada and the US. Like that would be that would not be a scenario. So how is this? Do you also think that's an European issue, that this appears to still be there? This issue of countries, nationalism, and wars against each other?
So I'm not an expert on on the political science at all. It's a difficult one for me to address, but it seems to me as a non-expert that in this particular case, you have a war that's unfortunately been decided by a single person, about Vladimir Putin, and maybe by his cohort, but I think that's a very dangerous thing when one person can make a decision that can throw the world into chaos. That's a very dangerous thing, whether it's Putin who's starting a war or whether in this country it's a president like Donald Trump who has the power to start a nuclear war. That's a very dangerous thing. We should never have that level of power be in the hands of a single person.
I agree. I agree. But again, about I would like to ask you again, just as a because you're as your American perspective, um, is it something that the Europeans do not seem to understand, to not have learned from history? Like as you said, okay, that's Putin. Maybe he decided it by himself because he has so much power, but still, he did we not understand enough what has happened? Did the Russians not understand what happened in the World War II and all the devastation? Is it like a lesson that has not been learned?
So I think to some extent you could say that there's some naivete in parts of Europe, especially in Germany, I would be afraid to say, but especially in Germany, it was very naive of the Germans to rely on Russian oil and gas and to think that having this cheap source of oil and gas would also lead to peace and security. That was naive. And I think the Germans realize now that that was naive. And I know Germany has been scrambling to find other sources of energy to not be reliant anymore on Russia. But you know, Europe is also a much more complicated place than North America. In North America, we have just three countries: Mexico, United States, and Canada. Two of those countries are English speaking. And in the United States, Spanish is basically a second language. There's such a large population of Spanish speakers here. So we have a kind of cultural uniformity in North America and a melting pot of cultures that doesn't really exist in Europe. I think Europe has been much less effective at integrating different kinds of people. Like look at the conflicts in France with immigrants in France. In France, all of the many decades of immigration, those people tend to live separated from other people in France. They tend to be lower socioeconomic status. They tend to be um, not be integrated into the society in the same way that immigrants are in the U.S. In a way, you could say the U.S. is very lucky because as a country of immigrants, it's very good at incorporating immigrants.
Mm.
And so I think Europe, through its diversity of languages and cultures, that's a wonderful thing. But at the same time, it also makes Europe more vulnerable to these nationalistic clashes like we're seeing.
Mm. And more vulnerable, maybe also to extreme leaders. We have elections in Spain were yesterday, and apparently there's a far right party which has gotten really strong. In France, there's a very far right strong party. Marine Le Pen is a populist politician. She is really far right. Giorgia Meloni is an Italian prime minister right now, very far right. So, do we see all these issues that we had 100 years ago coming over again? Like, is there a real possibility that this is happening again?
Yeah, and even in Germany, you have the Alternative for Germany party that's gained
Yes.
quite a bit of influence. So um, I guess it would be wonderful if we had better history education so people could have a better understanding of what happens when you follow these kinds of trajectories. And Europe has seen this before. Um, it's not just in Europe though. This nationalistic trend, it you know, it obviously impacted the United States. That's how we got the election of Donald Trump, um, and it's impacted some countries in Latin America, like Brazil has had a similar experience. So there's something that's been going on globally. Maybe it's a reaction to this globalization and the loss of feeling of individuality and self-reliance that many countries have experienced, the shifting of jobs from one part of the world to another. Like if you just go to your example of Spain that you brought up, Spain has some industrialized areas that have been devastated in terms of loss of jobs because those jobs have moved out of Spain. And so you have dispossessed people who, when you lose your job, you lose your sense of self-worth, and then it's easy to blame someone else for the problem. So I think a lot of the problems are the result of globalization. They're the result of uh, collapsing families. We have a huge problem in the United States with opioid addiction and with people losing one of their parents, and you have kids being raised, by single parents, and all of these sorts of things. So many of the problems of modern society, I think, make societies vulnerable to the rise of the right wing. And a simple message can make people feel comforted, even though that simple message can be a very dangerous thing to play out. And but if there's anywhere in the world you would think would know to avoid this, it's Europe. And in Spain, they had Franco. In Germany, you had Hitler. In Italy, which is the origin of fascism, arose first in Italy, they had Mussolini. So these are countries where you would think people would know we can't go down this route.
Exactly. This is something that should be learned. I think Germany is still a little bit better at the moment because we do not have a far-right leader. We have a social democratic chancellor at the moment, but the AfD, Populist Party, is at over 20% in the polls right now. And we have elections in 2 years. So there's a real risk that they are going to become second strongest party. But also in regards to elections, because the US is electing next year and Donald Trump is the most prominent running candidate for the Republicans, do you think that there's a high possible or a likelihood of him being reelected? Do you think that's in the realm of possibilities?
It's definitely in the realm of possibility, and it's a very dangerous scenario. We we are in a difficult situation because our president is quite old, and he doesn't have the same dynamism and the same abilities that he had 20 or 30 years ago. And he's going to be facing off against someone who is very effective at drawing attention. I mean, when Donald Trump is in the room, all eyes are on Donald Trump. That's all we hear about in the news. And so we'll see what happens. He's under indictment for many different crimes. He's going to be charged with additional crimes soon, and it's possible that those criminal investigations will finally end this nightmare of Donald Trump, but nobody knows.
Because the lawsuits, as you said, or the criminal investigations, there are, I think, 3 or 4 already going on, and it is like pretty tough things in different states, in New York, I think, and then also in Florida, and there are also federal investigations. So it's actually unprecedented that a president has that many criminal investigations going on around him while he's still running for being the next candidate for the Republicans for the next election. So isn't that something like no red lines exist anymore for this man, that he can cross any red line no matter what? It's just apparently the new reality.
Yeah, in fact, it's unprecedented even to have one criminal indictment against a former president. It's never happened before, and there are multiple criminal indictments, both federal and state. The state ones aren't, the one in New York is not a very serious one. That's the one about the Stormy Daniels payoff, the porn star payoff. That one's not a very serious one, but all the other ones are serious ones. The violation of the top secret documents that he had, that's a very clear-cut violation of federal law. And it seems like he'll get convicted of that one. The manipulation of the voting in Georgia is a very serious charge against him, and several others that are quite serious. So it's hard to know how that will play out. It would be just a horrible situation to have a president who's elected who's also been convicted of serious criminal wrongdoings. So I think we're in a dangerous time. I'm hoping that the system that we have in the United States is sufficiently robust that it prevents Donald Trump from being successful, that it prevents a criminal from getting back in the White House. I think it's robust enough, but I'm not sure. A lot of the things that I thought would never happen in this country happened when he was elected before. Um, so it is dangerous. That being said, we have more checks and balances in our system of government than you do in the European parliamentary systems, because we have this system of executive, judicial, and legislative branches, each of which can have checks of power on the others in a way that I don't think any other country in the world has as strong of a system of checks and balances. So hopefully that will be sufficient to prevent a criminal from becoming president again.
Yes, I agree, and I hope personally, I hope that this will not happen again, because I feel that would really make the world not the safest place, at least in terms of how to think of someone. You don't know what his next step will be. That was also the issue. You never know what he was doing next. Like it's impossible to calculate his next step. Maybe he himself doesn't know what he will do next day, but it's something that is dangerous when you're the political leader of the most powerful country in the world. But you said because Joe Biden is rather old, but Donald Trump's also almost 80, I think, or 78, 77 something. So isn't there also a need at some point for a younger leader, a younger president? The fact that two rather old men, almost 80 years old or 80 years old, are running for president possibly again in the US, isn't that an issue also for the young generation of American citizens, young students from university who are voting and who don't feel themselves maybe represented enough?
It's very frustrating. I had hoped that Biden would not run for re-election, but would leave an open field for a younger generation to come in and compete for who has the best ideas, who's best positioned to lead this country. And I think that if Biden had stepped aside and we had a younger person coming in on the side of the Democrats, that Trump wouldn't have a chance against that person. But he has a chance because he's running against Biden. And so that's very frustrating. I also, I would wish the Republican side would have someone who could effectively challenge Trump, because it's not, we need two strong parties in the United States. It's not good for our society to have one party that's strong and one party that's weak. And Donald Trump was essentially a third party who took over the Republican Party and molded it in his image. The Republican Party of before doesn't really exist right now. And I think it would be much better for our country if we got that party back. We had competition for ideas, because not all the good ideas are on one side. Both parties have good ideas, both parties have bad ideas. And our system is just out of whack right now with this populist trend that we have with Donald Trump. So I would have hoped that a younger generation came in on both sides and was able to have new ideas and new energy and not be rehashing the same kind of personal struggle between these two men.
Okay, so we should maybe hope that that will happen after the next elections, and possibly also with someone, maybe a woman, because that would be also interesting in the United States to see a woman, a female president. Do you think that would be likely for the next elections, or would that also cause maybe political turmoil because conservatives in the US would say we don't want a woman or something like that?
No, I think we'll have a woman president pretty soon, and I don't think there's going to be any objections from the conservative side. In fact, many of the conservative states in the United States were among the first states to have women governors, and there are a lot of female leaders on the conservative side. It's sort of like if you look around the world, you have conservative countries like Pakistan that have already had female prime ministers. It's not necessarily a conservative versus liberal thing, whether or not there's a female leader. There are plenty of excellent female candidates on both the liberal and the conservative side in the United States. So I think that will happen relatively soon. I think we have to get through this kind of it's like a log jam, with a lot of logs going down the river, and we have this older generation that are bottling up our politics. And once we get that through and we have newer people coming up, I'm sure we'll have good female presidents coming out in the United States.
Okay, that's a very positive and optimistic note towards the end. Mr. von Hippel, I thank you very much, or Frank, sorry, for this interview. It was very interesting. And if you would like to give a message out to my listeners towards the end about your personal opinion about the issues we discussed, you may do so now.
Well, it's nice to meet you, and I'm glad to see a younger generation being really interested in the serious environmental issues that we have to solve. And I would just suggest that people be optimistic, because the only way we're going to really find good solutions is if we feel like we can find good solutions to these problems. So it's important to be optimistic and to think what can we do and how do we do it, and let's make those solutions happen. It does require becoming educated about what the problems are, because we can't properly solve them without understanding them first. But these are things that we can do. And I have kids who are your age, and I see them bubbling with ideas for the future, and that's great. And that's what I want to see. I want to see younger people doing what they're doing, coming up with great ideas, working hard, and making those ideas happen.
Perfect. Then thank you very much, and hopefully talk to you soon.